German pilots once believed the Me-262 jet could save Nazi Germany from collapse. They called it the miracle weapon, the silver bullet that would restore air superiority and turn the tide of a losing war. But history proved otherwise, not because the technology failed, but because one man's catastrophic decision delayed the most advanced fighter of World War II until it was far too late. In this video, we uncover the hidden story of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. We'll reveal how Hitler's interference turned a potential game-changer into a tragic what-if. You'll meet the brilliant engineers who built it against impossible odds, the desperate pilots who flew it as Germany's last hope, and the Allied airmen who faced it in terror and disbelief. And we'll confront the haunting question still debated in military academies. Could this revolutionary aircraft have changed the outcome of the war if it had been deployed just 1 year earlier? Stay with us, because this is a story of genius and madness intertwined, of technology colliding with tragedy, and of the thin line between victory and defeat, drawn by a single decision. The skies over Germany. 1943. It is 1943, and the skies above Germany have become the deadliest battlefield on Earth. At dawn, the distant drone of engines builds into a thunderous roar that shakes windows and sends dread through every German household. Hundreds of American B-17 and B-24s, stretching for miles, glint in the sunlight like schools of predatory fish, protected by swarms of escort fighters. Their mission is relentless: to annihilate Germany's ability to wage war. Factories, refineries, rail yards, chemical plants, nothing is spared. Even the cities themselves, where workers live and children play, are targets in this new reality of total war. At night, the British take over with Lancasters and Halifaxes, delivering incendiaries designed to create firestorms. Hamburg is consumed in flames so fierce they generate hurricane winds. Cologne and Berlin burn night after night, their destruction visible for miles, while civilians huddle in shelters, praying their homes survive. But Germany's suffering is not only on the ground. The Luftwaffe, the once mighty air force that terrorized Europe, has become a shadow of its former self. Day after day, German pilots climb into Bf-109s and FW-190s to confront Allied bomber streams. Waiting for them are P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, faster, heavily armed, and flown by increasingly skilled American pilots. The toll is catastrophic. Veteran aces are dying faster than replacements can be trained. Young recruits arrive with barely 40 hours of flight time, and many last only days before being shot down. The Luftwaffe is bleeding to death in its own skies, and commanders know the end of their defensive system is approaching. Subscribe for more untold stories. If you want to keep uncovering hidden stories like this, where human drama and strategy collide, subscribe now. Every week we bring you untold World War II histories that shaped the war and the world. The visionary engineer and the dying Air Force. In an underground Luftwaffe bunker in Berlin, Hermann Göring paces nervously. Once arrogant, now bloated and broken, he lives with the humiliation of a promise he could not keep. No enemy bomber will ever reach the Ruhr. Call me Meyer if they do. By 1943, the cruel joke is reality. Bombers fill German skies daily, and civilians whisper his new name in ruins across the Reich. But while Göring sinks into despair, far from Berlin in Augsburg, a brilliant engineer named Willy Messerschmitt is working on something extraordinary. Thin, intense, and tireless, he knows that propeller fighters have reached their limit. At around 400 miles per hour, the laws of physics turn propeller blades into liabilities: shockwaves, drag, vibrations, and destruction. No material or clever trick can change this. Messerschmitt is convinced the future belongs to jet propulsion. Instead of spinning blades, a jet compresses air, mixes it with fuel, ignites it, and hurls the gases backward to produce raw thrust. Freed from propeller limits, jets can fly faster, higher, and strike with terrifying speed. For years, jets have been fragile experiments, unreliable, fuel-hungry, prone to disaster. But by 1943, as Allied bombs rain on Germany and the Luftwaffe collapses, Messerschmitt knows time is running out. If deployed in numbers and in time, his jet could revolutionize aerial combat and perhaps change the war itself. Birth of a revolution. The early development years. The story of the Me-262 began earlier than most realize, back in 1938, when Germany still looked to the future with confidence. Before the invasions and turning points of war, the Air Ministry issued Messerschmitt AG a contract to explore jet propulsion. It was speculative, futuristic work. At the time, jet engines were fragile, explosive experiments more likely to fail catastrophically than to power a fighter. Yet the Reich was planting seeds for tomorrow's war, even if the technology seemed decades away. Early jet engines were unpredictable, prone to sudden fires and catastrophic failures. The combustion chambers reached temperatures high enough to melt steel and aluminum. Only rare alloys of nickel, chromium, and molybdenum could survive, and even those were costly and difficult to produce. Despite these challenges, Messerschmitt and his chief designer Voldemar Voigt saw potential. Where others saw danger, they envisioned a fighter so advanced it would render every Spitfire, Hurricane, Bf-109, and Zero obsolete. Through 1938 and 1939, as Europe slid toward war, the team worked obsessively, testing designs in wind tunnels, experimenting with aerodynamics, solving engineering problems no one had ever faced. In April 1941, the first prototype, Me-262 V1, finally emerged. It looked like nothing else in the sky. Its most striking feature was its swept-back wings, angled at 18 degrees. This was no stylistic choice. It delayed the onset of shock waves near the speed of sound, maintaining control where straight-wing aircraft would fail. But the triumph came with humiliation. The BMW 003 turbojets intended for the Me-262 were nowhere near ready. They overheated, tore themselves apart, and frequently exploded during tests. Engineers promised solutions eventually, but eventually could not make an aircraft fly. So the Me-262 took to the skies for its first flight with a conventional piston engine awkwardly mounted in the nose, driving a wooden propeller. It was a bizarre sight. The world's first jet fighter dragged into the air by outdated technology, like a race car pulled by a horse. Photographs show the strange hybrid, half future, half past. Still, the test pilots reported the aircraft itself handled beautifully. The swept wings gave excellent stability. Controls were precise and predictable. The airframe was sound. Yet without working jet engines, the Me-262 remained a fascinating but impotent experiment, an expensive glimpse of the future that could not yet deliver on its promise. Solving the engine problem through persistence. Messerschmitt's team didn't give up in the face of this setback. They couldn't give up. Too much was riding on this project. Too many hopes were pinned on the promise of jet propulsion to restore German air superiority. Too many resources had already been invested to simply walk away when the first major obstacle appeared. They made the difficult decision to switch to a different engine design entirely, to abandon the problematic BMW 003 and instead adopt the Junkers Jumo 004, which was being developed in parallel by a competing engineering team at Junkers. This created some bureaucratic complications and wounded pride among the BMW engineers who felt their work was being abandoned prematurely, but the Jumo 004 showed significantly more promise in testing, with a more robust design philosophy and better thermal management systems that seemed less likely to result in catastrophic failures. The decision to switch engines meant redoing substantial portions of the airframe design to accommodate the different dimensions and mounting requirements of the Jumo 004, but it was a necessary step that ultimately proved correct, even though it cost precious months of development time. Through 1941 and into 1942, while Germany was still winning spectacular victories on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, while the war still seemed to be going decisively in Germany's favor, and ultimate victory seemed assured to many Germans, while most of the world's attention was focused on tank battles and infantry assaults. A small group of dedicated engineers worked frantically behind the scenes to solve the cascade of technical problems that plagued early jet engine technology. These weren't small problems or minor glitches that could be fixed with simple adjustments. They were fundamental engineering challenges that tested the limits of materials, science and thermodynamics, and mechanical engineering. Turbine blades, spinning at incredible speeds and exposed to temperatures that would melt ordinary metals, would develop microscopic cracks under the immense mechanical stress and extreme thermal cycling, cracks that would rapidly propagate until the blades shattered catastrophically, pieces of razor-sharp metal shooting through the engine at supersonic speeds, destroying everything in their path. Fuel injection systems couldn't handle the extreme flow rates required to feed the hungry jet engine's insatiable appetite for fuel, resulting in uneven combustion that reduced efficiency and increased the already severe thermal stresses. Control systems that worked perfectly well on the ground would behave unpredictably at high speeds and altitudes, sometimes causing the aircraft to become dangerously unstable. The controls responding in counterintuitive ways that could trap an inexperienced pilot in situations from which recovery was impossible. Each problem they painstakingly solved through weeks or months of testing and modification seemed to reveal 3 more problems lurking underneath, like peeling back the layers of an onion only to find more layers beneath, a seemingly endless succession of challenges that might never be completely resolved. The work was frustrating beyond measure, exhausting both physically and mentally, and occasionally genuinely dangerous in ways that office work and design work normally isn't. Test engines would explode without any warning signs, destroying expensive test stands, and sometimes injuring or even killing the engineers and technicians working nearby, men whose families would receive official letters expressing regret for their loss in service to the Reich. Components that worked absolutely perfectly in careful ground tests would fail immediately and catastrophically when installed in an actual aircraft and subjected to the vibrations, temperature extremes, and aerodynamic forces of real flight. Materials that seemed entirely adequate based on laboratory testing would prove unable to withstand the extreme conditions inside an operating jet engine, degrading rapidly or failing in unexpected ways that required going back to the beginning and trying different materials or different manufacturing processes. Progress was measured in small increments, tiny victories won through exhausting trial and error, successes that often came only after dozens or hundreds of failures, each failure teaching something valuable, but also consuming time and resources that Germany had in increasingly limited supply as the war dragged on and the strategic situation slowly deteriorated despite the optimistic propaganda. The historic first flight that changed everything. Then, on July 18, 1942, on a clear summer morning that would later be recognized as a watershed moment in aviation history, though few people realized it at the time, everything finally came together in one perfect moment that justified years of frustrating work and dangerous experimentation. The Me 262 V3 prototype, now equipped with 2 functional Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines slung beneath its wings in streamlined nacelles that were carefully designed to minimize drag, while providing adequate cooling airflow to the temperamental engines, sat on the runway at Leifheim Airfield in southern Germany. The airfield itself was relatively small and rural, far from major cities, chosen partly for security reasons to keep this revolutionary aircraft away from prying eyes, and partly for safety reasons in case something went catastrophically wrong during testing. It was a beautiful summer morning, the kind of perfect flying weather that pilots dream about. Clear skies stretched from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. The air was smooth and calm, with only light winds that wouldn't complicate the first flight of an experimental aircraft. The temperature was moderate, neither too hot nor too cold. Ideal conditions for testing new engine technology. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect, as if nature itself was cooperating with this moment of technological breakthrough. Test pilot Fritz Wendel, one of Germany's most experienced and highly respected aviators, a man who had flown literally dozens of experimental aircraft and understood intimately the risks inherent in testing revolutionary new technology, climbed into the Me-262's cockpit with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that any test pilot feels before a first flight. Wendel was a calm, methodical, professional pilot who never took unnecessary risks, who always followed procedures exactly, who had survived this long in a dangerous profession precisely because he was careful and thorough. He ran through his pre-flight checklist with meticulous care, checking every instrument systematically, testing every control for proper movement and response, examining every system to ensure everything was exactly as it should be. The ground crew, mechanics, and engineers who had worked on this aircraft for months stood watching nervously, their future careers in some sense dependent on whether this test flight would succeed or end in catastrophic failure, like so many previous attempts with jet-powered aircraft had ended. Wendel signaled to the ground crew that he was ready. They removed the wheel chocks, those simple blocks of wood that were all that held this revolutionary aircraft in place. Wendel placed his hands on the throttle levers, took a deep breath to steady his nerves, and slowly, carefully, smoothly advanced the throttles forward, feeding fuel to the jet engines and increasing their power output. The Jumo 004 engines spooled up with a high-pitched whine that was utterly unlike anything anyone present had ever heard from an aircraft before. There was no deep, throaty roar of a big piston engine at full power. No staccato, rhythmic bark of exhaust pulses. No mechanical clatter of reciprocating parts, of pistons hammering up and down in cylinders, of valves opening and closing hundreds of times per second. Just a smooth, steadily rising, increasingly loud scream that spoke of enormous power barely contained within those streamlined engine nacelles, of forces being unleashed that humans had never before successfully harnessed for sustained flight. The sound was eerie and unsettling and thrilling all at once, almost alien in its unfamiliarity, and everyone on the ground instinctively stopped whatever they were doing to listen to this sound from the future. Wendel released the wheel brakes, and the Me-262 began rolling forward, slowly at first, then gathering speed with surprising rapidity. The acceleration was noticeably, dramatically different from any propeller-driven aircraft. Instead of the jerky, somewhat uneven power delivery of a piston engine transmitted through a propeller, where you could feel each power pulse and each change in propeller pitch, the jet engines provided smooth, continuous, building thrust that seemed almost limitless, as if the aircraft would just keep accelerating forever if you let it. The Me-262 rolled down the grass runway, gathering speed remarkably quickly, covering ground far faster than the observers expected even though they knew intellectually what the performance calculations predicted. Within what seemed like just seconds but was probably 15 or 20 seconds in reality, far sooner than any conventional fighter aircraft would lift off, Wendel pulled back gently but firmly on the control stick, applying just the right amount of back pressure, and the Me-262's nose lifted gracefully, elegantly, almost effortlessly into the air. The aircraft climbed away from the runway at an angle that seemed impossibly steep to observers accustomed to conventional aircraft, its rate of climb absolutely astonishing even the engineers who had calculated what it should theoretically be capable of doing based on thrust-to-weight ratios and aerodynamic efficiency. It left a visible trail of heat shimmer in its wake, the hot exhaust from the jet engines creating wavering distortions in the air that marked its path across the sky like the wake of a ship across water. For the first time in human history, an aircraft was flying in sustained, controlled flight under pure jet power, with no propellers, no reciprocating engines, no connection to the old technology that had dominated aviation since the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk nearly 40 years earlier. This was genuinely something new, something revolutionary, something that marked a clear dividing line between the past and the future of aviation. And watching from the ground, seeing this sleek silver shape climb and bank and accelerate with casual ease, it was absolutely magnificent, a moment of pure technological triumph that everyone present knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. Gallen's prophetic vision and understanding. Among the men standing on the grass at Leifheim Airfield that flawless July morning was someone whose reaction would prove decisive for the Me-262's future. Adolf Galland was no ordinary witness. He was one of Germany's most celebrated fighter aces, credited with over 90 aerial victories. He had fought in the skies above the Channel, over France, and across the Mediterranean. Few men knew the realities of modern air combat more intimately. Galland had flown nearly everything the Luftwaffe possessed, from the biplanes of the Spanish Civil War to every mark of the Bf-109, and now the new Flo-190. Thousands of hours in cockpits had taught him not only the strengths of these machines but also their deadly weaknesses. He understood instinctively what an aircraft could and could not do, because in combat, hesitation or misjudgment meant death. Watching the Me-262 soar for the first time, Galland immediately grasped what others missed. This was no incremental advance. It wasn't simply a faster or slightly more maneuverable fighter. It was a fundamental break with the past, a leap so dramatic it threatened to make every other fighter on Earth, German, Allied, or Soviet, obsolete overnight. All the hard-earned tactics of the past 4 years suddenly seemed irrelevant. With proper training, new tactics, and above all, enough numbers, Galland realized this jet could potentially transform the entire air war. Weeks later, as the test program advanced, Galland was offered the chance to fly the jet himself. For a man who had tested dozens of aircraft, novelty was rare. He usually knew what to expect the moment he touched the controls. But climbing into the cockpit of the Me-262, advancing the throttles, and feeling the jet surge forward was like nothing he had ever experienced. When he landed, he struggled for words unusual for Galland. In his diary, he captured it with a phrase that has echoed through aviation history. It was as though an angel was pushing the aircraft from behind. The feeling of effortless acceleration was intoxicating. In piston fighters like the Bf-109 or Flo-190, maximum power always felt strained. The engine screamed, the propeller clawed at the air, and the aircraft seemed to hit a hard wall of resistance. Beyond that limit, no amount of skill could coax more speed. In the Me-262, that wall vanished. Push the throttles forward, and acceleration built smoothly, endlessly. The airspeed climbed higher and higher with no sense of limit. Outside, the world blurred into streaks of color, the kind of velocity Galland once believed belonged only to theory and wind tunnels. For Galland, the message was clear. The future of aerial combat was here, in metal and fire, flying above Leifheim that morning. And if Germany acted quickly, it might still change the course of the war. Revolutionary specifications that changed warfare. The specifications that Messerschmitt's team had managed to achieve through years of painstaking work and expensive experimentation were truly staggering. Numbers that made even experienced pilots and hardened engineers shake their heads in disbelief and wonder if the calculations could possibly be correct. Top speed in level flight, 540 miles per hour. Let that number sink in for a moment. 540 miles per hour. That was over 100 miles per hour faster than the absolute best Allied fighters currently in service, faster than the vaunted P-51 Mustang that American pilots swore by, faster than the latest marks of Spitfire that had evolved considerably since the Battle of Britain, faster than anything the Soviets had in their inventory. That speed advantage was enormous, decisive, potentially game-changing in combat. It meant that an Me-262 pilot could choose when and where to engage the enemy. He could approach from any angle he chose, make his attack run with devastating effect, and then simply accelerate away before Allied fighters could possibly respond or pursue effectively. He couldn't be caught by conventional fighters in level flight. He couldn't be run down in a chase. The only time he was vulnerable was during takeoff and landing, when his speed advantage disappeared, or if he made a serious tactical error and allowed himself to be trapped at low speeds. Rate of climb was equally impressive and tactically important, 3,500 feet per minute, allowing the Me-262 to intercept high-altitude bomber formations before they could reach their targets and drop their deadly payloads on German cities and factories. American bombers typically flew their missions at altitudes between 25 and 30,000 feet, heights where the thin air made conventional piston engines struggle and gasp for oxygen, where pilots and crews needed oxygen masks to avoid blacking out from hypoxia. But the Me-262 could climb to those altitudes in just over 8 minutes from takeoff, could reach bomber altitude while the bombers were still inbound, still many miles from their targets, giving the jets time to position themselves for optimal attack runs. Service ceiling, the maximum altitude at which the aircraft could maintain level flight, exceeded 37,000 feet, higher than almost all Allied bombers operated, high enough that Me-262 seconds could dive down onto bomber formations from above with tremendous speed advantage, using gravity to add even more velocity to their already incredible speed. Range with internal fuel load was approximately 650 miles, which was adequate if not exceptional for defensive operations throughout Germany and occupied territories, enough to intercept bomber streams anywhere over the Reich, and return safely to base if the pilot was careful with his fuel management, and didn't waste precious fuel in unnecessary maneuvering or extended combat. But the true terror, the element that would haunt Allied bomber crews in their nightmares and make them genuinely fear encounters with the Me-262, the real revolution in the aircraft's combat effectiveness, came from its devastating weapons loadout. 4 30mm Mk-108 cannons, all clustered tightly together in the nose of the aircraft, all firing straight forward along the aircraft's center line, all converging their fire at a carefully calculated distance where the combined firepower was absolutely devastating to any target it encountered. Each of these cannons was a fearsome weapon in its own right, firing explosive shells approximately the size of a man's clenched fist, each shell weighing about 12 ounces and packed with high explosive and incendiary material at a rate of 650 rounds per minute. The mathematics of destruction were straightforward and terrifying. A typical burst from all 4 cannons firing simultaneously for just 1 second would send approximately 43 explosive shells screaming through the air toward the target. If even a handful of those shells, perhaps 5 or 6, made contact with a heavy bomber, the results were catastrophic and usually instantly fatal for the aircraft and often for its crew. Allied bombers like the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress were specifically designed and engineered to absorb tremendous punishment and bring their crews home despite battle damage. They carried substantial armor plating protecting the pilots and other critical crew positions from machine gun fire. They had self-sealing fuel tanks that would automatically close around small puncture holes, preventing fuel from streaming out and igniting. They had redundant control systems so that if one cable was cut, others could still function. They could and routinely did absorb dozens of hits, sometimes even hundreds of hits, from rifle caliber and even 50 caliber machine gun fire, and still limp back to base in England with dead engines, wounded crew, and massive damage, testimony to both the aircraft's robust construction and the crew's determination to survive. But against 30mm high-explosive cannon fire, all of those defensive measures and that careful engineering became essentially irrelevant. The shells were simply too large, too powerful, too destructive to be defeated by any reasonable amount of armor or structural redundancy. A single solid hit from a 30mm shell could tear through control surfaces, severing the cables that allowed pilots to control the aircraft, leaving them helpless passengers in a machine that no longer responded to their inputs. 2 or 3 hits in quick succession could cause catastrophic structural failure, literally breaking the fuselage in half or separating a wing from the body, the aircraft disintegrating in mid-air before the crew even had time to realize what was happening, much less attempt to bail out. A hit to a fuel tank, even a self-sealing one, would often cause an immediate catastrophic explosion as the high-explosive shell detonated inside the tank, the resulting fireball consuming the aircraft in seconds. Hits to engines would cause them to literally explode, pieces of the engine breaking free and sometimes cutting through the wing structure or slicing through the fuselage. Later variants of the Me-262, as the design evolved and combat experience suggested improvements, would be equipped with an even more devastating weapons system that seemed almost unfair in its destructive potential. 24 unguided R-4M rockets mounted under the wings in streamlined racks, 12 rockets per side, arranged in neat rows. Each rocket was relatively small, about 21 inches long and just under 4 inches in diameter, but carried a substantial high-explosive warhead that weighed nearly 2 pounds, more than enough explosive to destroy or cripple a heavy bomber with a solid hit. The rockets could be ripple-fired, launched in rapid succession with just fractions of a second between launches, or fired in volleys of multiple rockets simultaneously, creating a virtual wall of high-explosive warheads flying through the airspace occupied by a bomber formation. In testing against drone aircraft and ground targets, results were stunning and terrifying. A single, well-aimed volley of R-4M rockets could destroy or severely damage multiple bombers simultaneously, the warheads detonating in a line through a bomber formation like a string of massive firecrackers, each explosion potentially killing an aircraft and its crew. Film from gun cameras mounted on test. Me-262 shows what this looked like in practice, and it's genuinely shocking to watch. The rockets streak away from the aircraft in nearly flat trajectories. Then multiple explosions blossom simultaneously among the target drones, orange fireballs and black smoke marking where aircraft were just moments before. The Me-262 wasn't just faster than Allied fighters by a significant margin. It wasn't just more capable than conventional interceptors in terms of climb rate and service ceiling. It was a purpose-built bomber-destroyer of absolutely unprecedented lethality. An aircraft specifically designed from the ground up to kill heavy bombers efficiently and survive to kill more the next day. Every design decision, every engineering choice, every component selection was made with this single mission in mind. Intercept Allied bomber formations, destroy as many bombers as possible with devastating firepower, and escape before the escorting fighters could respond effectively. In the hands of a skilled, experienced pilot who understood how to exploit the jet's capabilities while avoiding situations that negated its advantages, the Me-262 was the most dangerous interceptor aircraft flying anywhere in the world in 1944 and 45. Production plans and growing military enthusiasm. By early 1943, as winter gave way to spring and Germany's fortunes darkened despite endless propaganda, Messerschmitt's team had finally pushed the Me-262 past its earliest hurdles. The Jumo 004 engines, though still fragile and requiring constant care, had become reliable enough for frontline use. They no longer failed catastrophically in routine operation. Pilots could now expect 10-25 hours of flight before overhaul, hardly ideal, but sufficient in a war where aircraft rarely lived long anyway. Flight controls had been refined through countless adjustments until the jet handled predictably across its speed range. Weapons trials proved its cannons could fire at high speeds without jamming. The aircraft was ready for production, at least as ready as any radical innovation could be under wartime pressure. Production planning began with German thoroughness. Binders of specifications and assembly steps were drawn up. Factories retooled their lines, replacing equipment meant for piston fighters with new machinery tailored for jets. Workers were trained in advanced techniques for assembling airframes and fitting engines that demanded precision beyond anything seen in conventional aircraft. Supply chains were established to deliver the rare alloys, high-temperature seals, and precision bearings that kept the Jumo 4 seconds alive. Pilot training programs were created to teach men how to handle this alien machine, to exploit its strengths while surviving its quirks. If everything went smoothly, if bombings didn't cripple factories, if trains kept running, if raw materials kept flowing, Germany could have fielded operational Me 262 squadrons by late summer or fall of 1943. The implications were staggering. Imagine bomber formations of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds suddenly falling under attack from jets that no Allied fighter could catch or match. For months, the Americans would have had no answer. No one understood this better than Adolf Galland. Now promoted to general of the fighter arm, he saw the situation with brutal clarity. Germany was losing the air war, and conventional fighters could no longer stem the tide. The Allies had too many planes, too many skilled pilots, and an industrial base that dwarfed Germany's. Galland argued tirelessly through memos, presentations, and personal appeals that only the Me-262 could restore balance. "Build them in the thousands," he urged. "Equip entire wings, train pilots in new tactics, get them into combat immediately." The jet, he believed, could make the bombing campaign too costly for Roosevelt and Churchill to sustain. Even Hermann Goering, usually blinded by arrogance and dulled by addiction, agreed. Stung by constant criticism and desperate for redemption, he seized upon the Me-262 as a miracle that could restore the Luftwaffe's reputation. Orders were issued for mass production as a fighter interceptor, the weapon Germany needed most. Factories began preparing, schedules were approved, resources prioritized. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Germany might actually seize this narrow chance. And then, Adolf Hitler inspected the aircraft. During what should have been a routine visit, one deceptively simple question revealing his ignorance of both strategy and technology changed everything. With a single decision, he would cripple Germany's greatest innovation before it ever had the chance to alter the war. Hitler's fatal decision. The catastrophic turning point. November 2nd, 1943. The date Luftwaffe officers and aviation historians would remember as the moment Germany's last realistic hope in the air war was destroyed, not by enemy action, but by the Führer's own interference. Hitler's armored train, his mobile headquarters, pulled into Insterburg, East Prussia, with typical punctuality. He had come to inspect demonstrations of Germany's newest wonder weapons, endlessly promoted by Goebbels as proof that technological superiority would still deliver victory. The V-2 rocket, brilliant but ruinously expensive for its small payload. New heavy tanks meant to counter Soviet T-34 seconds and American Shermans. And, most tantalizing, the Me-262 jet fighter, the one weapon that seemed to offer genuine hope. By late 1943, Hitler had grown detached from military reality, spending his days in fortified headquarters, issuing orders shaped more by ideology and intuition than by reports from the front. His health was visibly failing, an insistent tremor in his left hand, erratic sleep, and volatile moods that could pivot from calm to rage in seconds. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, injected him daily with a shifting cocktail methamphetamine, testosterone, experimental compounds whose combined effects were unpredictable. Objectively, the man making life and death decisions for millions was gravely ill, but he remained the absolute dictator, beyond challenge. On this gray November day, however, the Me-262 jolted him into rare excitement. The demonstration had been choreographed to impress. The jet climbed at an impossibly steep angle, banked hard at speeds no propeller aircraft could safely manage, then accelerated away with breathtaking ease. Its high-pitched whine, unmistakably jet propulsion, sounded like the future arriving. Hitler watched intently, eyes tracking the silver shape across the cold air, his tremor momentarily forgotten. The aircraft landed cleanly, taxied to the viewing area, and shut down. Hitler approached with his entourage of decorated generals, adjutants, SS guards, and party courtiers. He circled the jet, studying it with the focused curiosity he usually reserved for architectural models, running his hand along the smooth skin, peering into the engine nacelles, examining the swept wings from multiple angles. then climbing a ladder to scan the cockpit and instruments, as if committing them to memory. At last he turned to Willy Messerschmitt, flanked by tense engineers fearful of saying anything that might spark one of Hitler's legendary rages. The Führer's question was simple, direct, and disastrous. Can this aircraft carry bombs? A heartbeat of silence. Messerschmitt understood instantly there was no safe answer. Say no, and Hitler might lose interest and cut support. Say yes, and he might seize on the idea and wrench the design into a role it was never meant to fill. But Hitler did not tolerate hesitation. Choosing words like a man tiptoeing through a minefield, Messerschmitt replied, "Yes, with modification the Me 260-2 could carry a limited bomb load, perhaps 500 kilograms, potentially up to 1,000, with significant airframe and systems changes." Hitler's eyes lit with enthusiasm that alarmed everyone who understood aircraft and air strategy. His mind leapt ahead to the looming Allied invasion, expected in spring or summer 1944. Intelligence was unequivocal. The Allies were massing in southern England, stockpiling for the greatest amphibious assault in history. They would come across the Channel, Calais, perhaps. Or Normandy and Germany would have to strike instantly and devastatingly. In Hitler's vision, the Me 262 would be the answer. A blitzbomber, a lightning-fast attacker that could penetrate Allied air defenses, smash the invasion fleet, strike the beaches and supply dumps, and escape before interception. If fast bombers could slaughter troops and sink transports at the water's edge, perhaps the invasion would collapse, and with it the Allied will to fight. Around him, generals and experts recognized the catastrophe forming. Photographs from that day seemed to capture the truth in strained smiles and rigid postures, men forcing expressions of agreement while their minds reeled. Near the back stood Adolf Hitler. His stomach dropped. He wanted to say what every competent airman knew. The Me 260-2 was designed as a fighter. Its speed and firepower made it a supreme bomber-destroyer. Converting it into a bomber would demand extensive redesign, delay production by months, and squander its greatest strengths at the very moment Germany needed them most. But by late 1943, contradicting Hitler could end a career or a life. Officers who pressed their objections were relieved, sidelined, arrested, or simply vanished into the SS machinery. The message throughout the Wehrmacht was clear: do not challenge the Führer. So Galland stayed silent, searching the faces around him for someone with the rank or courage to intervene. No one spoke. No one objected. The decision final, absolute, was issued. The Me 260-2 would be developed as a bomber, the Schnellbomber. It was a direct order from Adolf Hitler, not a suggestion or a topic for debate. And with that single command, Germany's most promising weapon was diverted from the role that might have changed the air war, condemned to arrive too late and in the wrong form to matter. The year that was lost asterisk. What followed that fateful November day was a bureaucratic and engineering nightmare that would consume nearly a full year of precious time that Germany could not afford to lose, time during which the strategic situation deteriorated further with each passing week. Production of the Me 262 as a fighter was immediately and completely halted by direct order from the Führer himself, transmitted through proper military channels but carrying the unmistakable weight of Hitler's personal authority. The production lines that had been carefully prepared, the manufacturing processes that had been meticulously documented and refined, the supply chains that had been painstakingly established, everything stopped dead in its tracks as if a switch had been flipped. Engineers and technicians who had been working on finalizing the fighter variant for mass production were abruptly pulled off their current assignments and told to begin the complex task of redesigning the aircraft from scratch, accommodate a bombing role it was never intended to fill. This wasn't a simple modification, not merely a matter of bolting on some bomb racks and updating the pilot's manual. The entire airframe needed to be substantially strengthened to handle the additional weight and the new structural stresses of carrying external ordnance. Metal spars had to be reinforced with additional material. Load-bearing structures throughout the fuselage had to be completely redesigned and extensively tested. New bomb racks had to be designed from first principles, manufactured to precise specifications, and then integrated with the aircraft's existing systems in ways that didn't compromise aerodynamic performance too severely. The fuel system required extensive, complicated modification because bombs mounted externally under the fuselage dramatically changed the aircraft's center of gravity, affecting how it handled in flight, how much fuel it could carry, where that fuel had to be stored to maintain proper balance, and how fuel had to be transferred between tanks during flight to keep the aircraft controllable as fuel was consumed and weight distribution changed. The nose section needed to be completely redesigned from scratch to give the pilot better downward visibility for the challenging task of identifying and bombing ground targets while traveling at speeds exceeding 500 miles per ration hour. Speeds at which the ground rushed past in a blur and accurate bomb aiming became nearly impossible without specialized equipment. New instruments had to be designed, manufactured, tested, and installed. Bomb sights had to be adapted or created specifically for the unprecedented speeds and altitudes the Me-262 could achieve, speeds and altitudes that existing bomb sights had never been designed to handle. Release mechanisms had to be developed that could safely and reliably drop bombs from an aircraft moving faster than any bomber in existence, mechanisms that would ensure the bombs cleared the aircraft cleanly without striking the fuselage or wings, mechanisms that could handle the aerodynamic forces involved in releasing bombs at such high speeds. Every single one of these changes, each modification large and small, required new blueprints drawn by hand in painstaking detail. New structural calculations had to be performed to ensure the modified aircraft could handle the stresses. New stress analyses had to be conducted, testing the strengthened structures to their limits. New wind tunnel testing had to be done to verify that the external bombs didn't create unacceptable drag or dangerous aerodynamic effects. New manufacturing processes had to be developed because building a bomber was different from building a fighter. New quality control procedures had to be written and implemented. New training protocols had to be created for both the factory workers who would build these modified aircraft and the pilots who would eventually fly them. The complexity and scope of the required changes was enormous, touching virtually every aspect of the aircraft's design and construction. Weeks passed with agonizing, frustrating slowness, each week bringing Germany closer to defeat. Then months accumulated, precious months during which Germany's cities continued to burn, during which Allied bombers struck German factories and rail yards and refineries with increasing frequency and accuracy, during which the Luftwaffe's conventional fighter force continued to be ground down through unsustainable attrition. The factories in Regensburg and Augsburg and other locations throughout Germany that should have been producing hundreds of Me-262 fighters, aircraft that could have been defending German airspace and killing Allied bombers by the dozens, instead sat partially idle or shifted to other work, their carefully prepared assembly lines quiet and unused, their highly skilled workers waiting endlessly for final specifications on the bomber variant that kept changing as engineers discovered new problems that required design changes. Components and subassemblies accumulated in warehouses and storage facilities, carefully manufactured parts produced by skilled workers that couldn't be installed because there were no completed aircraft to put them in, parts that represented enormous investments of time and resources and expertise sitting uselessly on shelves gathering dust. Engines sat in wooden crates, their precious and limited operational life slowly ticking away, even while unused because the exotic materials and special alloys inside them degraded over time regardless of whether the engines were actually running. Weapons systems were manufactured and tested, and then set aside waiting for aircraft that weren't being built. Landing gear assemblies waited patiently on storage racks. The entire complex production pipeline, which had been gearing up systematically to produce hundreds of revolutionary fighters that might have changed the course of the air war, had ground to a complete and frustrating halt, paralyzed by indecision and constantly changing requirements, and the need to solve problems that should never have existed if the aircraft had been allowed to remain in its intended role. Adolf Galland, watching this catastrophe unfold day by day with increasing desperation and frustration, became almost frantic in his attempts to get the Me-262 program back on track and focused on its proper mission. He knew with mathematical certainty, proven by loss reports and replacement statistics, that arrived on his desk every single day, that every week of delay was another week during which Germany lost more irreplaceable experienced pilots, more aircraft that couldn't be quickly replaced, more cities and factories to Allied bombing that systematically destroyed Germany's ability to continue fighting. He understood that the strategic window for deploying the Me-262 effectively was rapidly closing, that there was a finite period during which the jet could make a real difference, and that every month of delay brought that window closer to slamming shut permanently. Galen tried everything within his considerable power and authority to reverse, or at least modify Hitler's catastrophic decision. He went repeatedly to Hermann Göring, despite knowing that the Reich Marshal's influence with Hitler had diminished severely, hoping that Göring would understand the strategic urgency and would risk his remaining standing with the Führer to intervene and explain that the Me-262 was desperately needed as a fighter, not as a bomber. But Göring, thoroughly cowed by years of Hitler's abuse and public humiliation, terrified of provoking another rage that might result in his complete removal from all positions of authority, refused categorically to take any action that might be interpreted as questioning the Führer's judgment. Göring had lost most of his once absolute control over the Luftwaffe through a combination of his own incompetence, his drug addiction, his disconnection from operational realities, and Hitler's increasing tendency to bypass him entirely and issue orders directly to lower-level commanders. He was in absolutely no position to challenge Hitler's direct orders, and he had no intention whatsoever of trying, regardless of how strategically insane those orders might be. Galland, desperate and increasingly willing to take risks to his own career, and possibly his freedom or even his life, went over Göring's head in a dangerous breach of military protocol and proper chain of command. He appealed directly to Hitler's chief of staff and to other high-ranking officials who might have access to the Führer's ear during his lucid moments, bypassing the normal channels through which military matters were supposed to flow. He wrote detailed, carefully argued memoranda, explaining with brutal statistical honesty exactly how many fighters Germany was losing each week in combat, how many experienced pilots were being killed faster than replacements could be trained, how the American daylight bombing campaign was systematically and methodically destroying Germany's industrial capacity to produce weapons and fuel and all the other materials necessary to continue fighting. He included graphs and charts and projections showing that at current loss rates, which were actually accelerating rather than stabilizing, the Luftwaffe would be completely unable to mount any effective defense of German airspace within just a few months, that the defensive system would collapse entirely under the weight of unsustainable attrition. But it was all completely, utterly useless. Hitler had issued a direct order, and that order carried the force of absolute law that could not be questioned or modified by anyone, regardless of their rank or their expertise, or the obvious correctness of their arguments. More than that, making the situation even more impossible, Hitler had gone much further than simply ordering the development of a bomber variant. He had explicitly forbidden, under penalty of immediate dismissal from command or possibly worse consequences, anyone from even mentioning the Me-262 as a fighter in his presence. The subject was completely closed to discussion. Officers who violated this edict, who even obliquely suggested that perhaps the aircraft might be more valuable in a defensive interceptor role than as a bomber, who tried in even the most diplomatic and careful language to question whether the bomber conversion was the optimal use of this revolutionary technology, faced swift and severe consequences that served as warnings to others who might be tempted to speak up. D-Day. The complete failure of Hitler's gamble. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The date that Hitler had simultaneously feared and anticipated for months, the invasion he had prepared Germany to resist, the Allied assault that in his mind justified his decision to convert the Me-262 into a fast bomber. Dawn breaks gray and overcast over the beaches of Normandy in northern France. Despite the poor weather that the Germans assumed would prevent any invasion attempt, despite the rough seas that should have made amphibious operations impossible, despite every rational calculation that suggested the Allies would wait for better conditions, the horizon suddenly fills with ships, thousands of ships, an armada so vast that it seems to cover the entire English Channel from shore to shore. the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled in the entire history of human warfare. 156,000 Allied troops, American and British and Canadian soldiers who have trained for this moment for years, storm ashore on 5 beaches that would become famous, their code names entering history: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. The sky above the invasion fleet, despite the low clouds and poor visibility, is thick with aircraft. More aircraft than most observers had ever seen in one place. Fighters flying combat air patrol provide protective cover over the fleet and the beaches, ready to shoot down any German aircraft foolish enough to approach. Medium and heavy bombers pound German defensive positions inland, trying to disrupt communications and prevent reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Fighter bombers strafe roads and rail lines, transport aircraft, barely visible in the clouds, drop paratroopers behind enemy lines to seize key bridges and crossroads and create chaos in the German rear areas. The Allies have achieved virtually complete air superiority through years of systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's capability, through the grinding attrition campaign that destroyed Germany's fighter force despite all the bravery and skill of German pilots. German fighters that dare to approach the massive invasion fleet are quickly intercepted and shot down by overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft, or they're driven off before they can make any meaningful attacks. And Hitler's jet bombers, the entire justification for converting the Me-262 from its designed role as a fighter, the aircraft that were supposed to devastate the invasion fleet at its most vulnerable moment, and perhaps force the Allies to abandon their assault entirely, are completely, conspicuously, embarrassingly nowhere to be seen. They don't exist in operational form. Not a single Me-262 bomber is ready for combat. Not one. Not even a prototype that could be rushed into service for a desperate attack. The aircraft that were supposed to be attacking the beaches at first light on invasion day, that were supposed to be bombing the ships and strafing the landing craft and destroying the supply concentrations, sit incomplete and non-functional in factories scattered throughout Germany hundreds of miles from the invasion beaches. They sit as incomplete airframes waiting for final components. They sit as finished aircraft waiting for engines that haven't been delivered. They sit waiting for pilots who haven't been trained to fly them. They are victims of design delays that consumed months of precious time, of resource shortages as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains, of manufacturing problems as factories struggled to build an aircraft that kept changing as engineers discovered new issues, of Allied bombing raids on the factories themselves that killed workers and destroyed machine tools and set back production schedules by weeks. Within just a few hours of the first landings, it becomes increasingly clear to even the most optimistic German commanders that the invasion will succeed despite the fierce and determined resistance of German defenders. The German soldiers and officers on the beaches fight with tremendous courage and determination, inflicting severe casualties on the invading Allied forces, particularly on Omaha Beach, where American troops face withering fire and suffer terrible losses. But courage and determination, however admirable, cannot overcome the fundamental imbalance in forces. The Allies have overwhelming superiority in numbers that cannot be matched. They have overwhelming superiority in firepower from naval guns offshore that can pulverize German defensive positions. They have air support that the Germans simply cannot match or counter. They have detailed intelligence about German defenses from months of reconnaissance. They have the initiative and the ability to concentrate forces at points of their choosing. By the end of that first long, bloody day, over 150,000 Allied soldiers are firmly ashore and steadily expanding their precarious beachheads despite German counterattacks. Within 1 week, the numbers swell dramatically to over 300,000 Allied troops on French soil, with more arriving every single day on ships that travel unmolested across the Channel. Within 2 weeks, nearly 1 million Allied troops are in France, and the breakout from the beaches has begun in earnest, with American, British, and Canadian forces pushing inland against crumbling German resistance, advancing toward Paris and the German border beyond. Hitler's strategic gamble, the decision that doomed the Me-262 fighter program for nearly a year, has failed completely and catastrophically and undeniably. The jet bombers that were supposed to be the decisive weapon that would change history, that would stop the invasion and perhaps force the Allies to negotiate, never materialized. They never flew even a single combat mission during the critical first days when they supposedly would have been most valuable. The invasion that was supposed to be stopped by German air power, by fast jet bombers that the Allies couldn't intercept or counter, proceeds almost exactly according to the detailed Allied plans, with only minor deviations from the expected timeline. And Germany has absolutely nothing to show for the year of delay except empty factories that haven't built the fighters that were desperately needed, pilots who haven't been trained on jets that don't exist, squadrons that haven't been equipped, and a military situation that has deteriorated from bad to desperate to nearly hopeless. The catastrophic failure of D-Day, the complete absence of the wonder weapons that German propaganda had promised would save the Reich, the stark demonstration that Hitler's strategic judgment was fundamentally flawed, finally forces the Führer to partially relent on his disastrous decision. In late June 1944, with Allied armies firmly established in France and beginning their advance inland, with Soviet armies preparing massive summer offensives in the east that would destroy entire German army groups, Hitler grudgingly, reluctantly permits limited production of the Me 262 to resume specifically as a fighter. Not because he believes he was wrong about the bomber concept. Hitler was psychologically incapable of genuinely admitting major mistakes or accepting that his judgment might have been flawed. Not because he's learned anything meaningful from his strategic error, or because he's finally willing to listen to the advice of military professionals who actually understand air warfare, but simply because the overall military situation has deteriorated so badly, so completely, so obviously even to him in his bunker, isolated from reality, that Germany desperately needs every weapon it can possibly deploy, regardless of Hitler's personal preferences or his strategic theories about how the war should be fought. Into combat. Too little, too late. By September 1944, exactly 1 full year after Hitler made his fateful decision at Insterburg, 12 full months of delay that Germany could not afford, the first operational Me 262 fighter unit is finally, at long last, formed and declared ready for combat operations against Allied bombers. Kommando Nowotny, named after its commander Major Walter Nowotny, who was one of Germany's greatest and most celebrated fighter aces, with an absolutely astonishing 258 confirmed victories accumulated over years of intense combat on multiple fronts. Nowotny was already a legend throughout the Luftwaffe, a pilot whose name was known to every German fighter pilot, and whose skills and courage were absolutely unquestioned. He was a natural leader who inspired confidence and loyalty in the men under his command, exactly the kind of officer needed to take a revolutionary new aircraft type into combat for the first time and develop the tactics that would allow it to be used effectively. The unit consists of just 30 pilots flying whatever Me 262 seconds can be scraped together from the limited production. On September 26, 1944, the Me 262 finally enters combat as a fighter after a year of senseless delay, and it proves to be everything its designers promised. Allied bomber crews have no idea what's about to hit them. Then something appears that moves faster than anything they've ever seen. No propeller. Just a sleek shape that materializes from nowhere, makes a single pass, and vanishes. In that brief moment, 3 B-17 seconds explode. Not damaged. Exploded. Wings torn off. Fuselages broken in half. Lieutenant Frank Woolner writes home, "We saw something moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. No propeller. Just this dark shape, and 3 of our birds just exploded. Then it was gone. We couldn't even fire at it. It was like being attacked by something from another world." The Allies have encountered the Me 262, and nothing will ever be quite the same. The technology that changed aviation. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, intact Me 262 seconds were being shipped to testing facilities in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. At Wright Field in Ohio, American test pilots flew German jets and filed reports filled with superlatives. The British conducted similar tests at Farnborough. The Soviets captured numerous aircraft and German engineers. What they all discovered was that the Me-262 was at least 5 years ahead of anything the Allies had in development. The swept wings, the engine design, the aerodynamic solutions, all represented breakthroughs that Allied engineers hadn't even begun to consider. The influence on post-war aviation was immediate and profound. The American F-86 Sabre, which would dominate Korean War skies, shows unmistakable Me-262 influence in its swept wings and overall design philosophy. The Soviet MiG-15 similarly incorporated German technology. Every modern jet fighter can trace its lineage back to Messerschmitt's revolutionary design. Every jet engine incorporates lessons from those early Jumo turbines. The what-if scenario. Consider the counterfactual carefully. Imagine Hitler had not insisted on the bomber conversion. Imagine production had continued uninterrupted from early 1943. By summer that year, operational squadrons could have been defending Germany. By fall, hundreds could have been in service. By early 1944, Germany might have fielded 2,000 jet fighters. What would this have meant? The honest answer is catastrophic for the Allies. Loss rates among American bomber crews, already severe, would have become completely unsustainable. The strategic bombing campaign might have been forced to suspend daylight operations entirely. The invasion of France might have been delayed while new tactics were developed. The war might have been extended by months or even a year. But would it have changed the ultimate outcome? Almost certainly not. By 1943, Germany's strategic position was essentially hopeless. The Soviet Union had fully mobilized its vast industrial capacity and was producing weapons in numbers Germany could never match. America had committed its enormous economic might to defeating the Axis. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly superior resources. Even with 2,000 Me-262 seconds, Germany still faced millions of Soviet soldiers advancing from the east, still faced the combined industrial might of America and Britain, still faced fuel shortages and resource depletion, and the systematic destruction of its ability to continue fighting. The Me-262 might have prolonged Germany's agony. It might have killed tens of thousands more Allied airmen and soldiers. It might have delayed the inevitable end by months, but it could not have won the war. This is the tragic reality at the heart of the Me-262 story. It was brilliant technology in service of a lost cause, arriving too late even to prolong the inevitable. The human cost. The men who flew and designed the Me-262 had varied fates. Adolf Hitler survived the war and eventually immigrated to Argentina, working as an aviation consultant. He returned to Germany in the 1950s and became a successful businessman. He lived long enough to see jet aviation become commonplace worldwide, dying in 1996 at age 83, having witnessed the entire evolution of the technology he had championed decades earlier. Walter Novotny was not so fortunate. On November 8, 1944, just 6 weeks after his unit began operations, Novotny was shot down and killed, probably by American P-51 seconds catching his jet during its vulnerable landing approach. He was 23 years old, one of Germany's greatest aces, dead in the aircraft that was supposed to restore German air superiority. Willy Messerschmitt spent 2 years in detention after the war, while Allied investigators examined whether he had used slave labor. He was eventually cleared of major charges and returned to civilian life, designing prefabricated buildings and eventually returning to aviation consulting. He died in 1978 at age 80, reportedly bitter that his greatest achievement had been corrupted by political interference and deployed too late to fulfill its potential. The enduring lessons. Military academies around the world still teach the Me-262 story as a cautionary tale about strategic leadership. It demonstrates how even the most brilliant technology can be squandered through poor decision-making at the highest levels. How micromanagement by political leaders who don't understand technical and tactical realities can cripple military effectiveness. How allowing personal preferences and ideological obsessions to override expert advice leads to disaster. These lessons transcend their specific historical context and remain relevant for any organization, military or civilian, facing complex decisions about technology and strategy. The story also illustrates the complex relationship between technology and warfare. Wars are not won by individual weapons, however advanced. They are won by nations and systems working together effectively, by industrial capacity, by resource availability, by competent leadership making sound strategic decisions. Germany had the most advanced fighter in the world, but that technological advantage was rendered meaningless by strategic overreach, poor leadership, and the overwhelming combined strength of its enemies. There exists a photograph, now preserved in archives worldwide, that captures the entire Me 262 tragedy in a single frozen moment. Taken in April 1945 at a captured airfield, it shows a pristine Me 262 sitting in bright spring sunlight. The aircraft appears almost new, its swept wings elegant and deadly. In the background, columns of smoke rise from burning buildings. American soldiers stand nearby, rifles casually slung, cigarettes dangling, looking relaxed and bored. The war is effectively over. They've won. The jet sits silent, already transitioning from weapon to museum piece. That stark contrast between advanced technology and utter defeat somehow captures everything. This aircraft represented genuine genius, legitimate innovation, a glimpse of aviation's future. But it arrived too late, in numbers too small, in service of a regime doomed by its own strategic blindness and moral bankruptcy. Today, more than 80 years later, the Me 262's influence remains visible in every jet fighter ever built. The swept wings, the engine placement, the fundamental aerodynamic principles all trace back to Messerschmitt's revolutionary design. But the most important legacy isn't technical. It's the lesson about hubris and timing, about genius undermined by incompetent leadership, about the gap between what might have been and what actually was. The Me 262 teaches us that strategy matters more than technology, that leadership decisions have consequences that echo through history, that wars are won by nations and systems, not individual weapons. The jet fighter from the future arrived too late to save Germany, but just in time to shape aviation's future for generations. We'll never know what might have happened if Hitler had simply trusted his engineers and military professionals. What if the Me 262 had reached combat squadrons a year earlier? What if 2,000 jets had been defending Germany by mid-1944? The answers remain forever unknowable, locked in the realm of historical speculation. We can only study the decisions, learn the lessons, and remember that even the most brilliant technology is worthless in the hands of incompetent leadership. The Me 262 could have changed the course of World War II, but Hitler waited too long. And by the time the jet finally roared into combat, the future had already been decided. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of World War II's most fascinating what-if stories. The Messerschmitt Me 262 represents both the pinnacle of German wartime engineering and a stark demonstration of how poor strategic leadership squanders even the most brilliant technological achievements. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden history, subscribe to our channel right now. We bring you untold stories from World War II that explore the complex decisions and strategic mistakes that shaped the conflict. Hit that like button to help this video reach more history enthusiasts who appreciate thorough research and detailed analysis. And please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Do you think the Me 262 could have significantly changed the war if deployed earlier? What other World War II stories would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps us decide what to cover next. From all of us at WW2 Untold Stories, thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, comment, and we'll see you in the next episode.